paragraph 63, Dr. Jung is saying that in the East, they give full expression to creative fantasy, and it's embedded in a web of extraordinary variety. Now, I'll just give you a couple of examples. Tankas are used in Tibet for meditation, to meditate upon. This particular tanka is Avalokiteshvara, who is the Buddha of compassion. And as you can see in this image, you have dakinis up here that are up in heaven, and you have the Buddha or Amitabha, the primary Buddha, and you have various other things, but among other things, and then you have these two women here, but also there are things that you don't necessarily see, but they pop out at you. In other words, in these tankas, if you stare at them, and so for example, if you look right here, this looks like a scarf that's there, but actually it could as easily be a snake. Okay. But if you look at it just at a superficial level, it just looks like a scarf. And the same is on the other side of the image over here. But there are other things, like there's a snake here that's looking up over this area, and there's his tongue sticking out, that sort of thing. And here, these clouds also look like eyes that are overseeing you. And so as you meditate on a tanka, it'll take you deeper in and create these fantasies. But the thing about it is, the Buddhist monks will never admit that to you. Okay, in other words, I have a local Tibetan Buddhist monk whose meditation classes I go to every week. And so I've known him for a long while now, 7 or 8 years. And even he won't admit to me that there is a second layer to these images. But the point is that that we regard such fantasies as worthless daydreaming, subjective daydreaming. The East, they reject these fantasies because it has long since been extracted. The essence of them has been extracted from them, and they're condensed into profound teachings. And so our experience is quite different. But in my experience with the Tibetan Buddhist lamas, they will not admit that there's anything else in these images. And yet, in the East, they consider these as fantasies that they reject. All right, so you should be seeing my text now. Is that right? Are you seeing that as primary thing on the screen?
Yeah, he just confirmed that he wanted you to show the notes.
So one of the key things that Dr. Jung says in paragraph 63 is that our knowledge of the external world is the greatest obstacle to introspection. In other words, the I Ching and the Secret of the Golden Flower were developed a couple thousand years ago, and so they didn't have the obstruction of all the facts that we know today. We just know too many facts. And so Dr. Jung's point was, but the psychological need will overcome all obstruction. And so what he means by that is we need to do this introspection, because if we don't, we're going to destroy ourselves. That's the point. So we're building up a psychology, he says, we're building up a psychology to the very things that the East discovered a couple thousand years ago, but only through abnormal psychic states, which they were developing themselves through their meditation techniques. And of course, they've been meditating for a couple thousand years. Okay, so the next phase of the Secret of the Golden Flower is this section 5, the detachment of consciousness from the object. And by this, he means paragraph 64, by understanding the unconscious, we free ourselves from its domination. And in paragraph 65, detachment of consciousness from the world, observing from outside. Consciousness is both empty and not empty. Consciousness is no longer preoccupied with compulsive plans, but dissolves into contemplative vision. Okay, so at this point, I wanted to bring to your attention this. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. I'll come back at paragraph 66, but I wanted to read to you. I have Psychic Energy here by Edith Harding. Okay, and this is an excellent book. I had to buy it used, but now they seem to have it back in print on Amazon. So I guess my readings from it have brought people back to it. It's a very good book and very powerful. But one of the things that she talks about is the phases of consciousness in psychology, and Jungian psychology, are similar to the phases of consciousness in Buddhism. And so I just want to read this one page. And this is Psychic Energy, Its Source and Its Transformation by M. Esther Harding, with a foreword by C.G. Jung, and it's published by Princeton University Books. I'm on page 26 of the paperback edition of this book. It is interesting to observe that the Buddhists of the Mahayana sect also distinguish 3 stages of human consciousness, which correspond to a surprising degree to the stages we have differentiated here. The Naïve stage, ruled over by the autos, in which the individual is completely dominated by his bodily needs and desires, marks the quote, man of little intellect. The consciousness of such a man is exceedingly narrow, being bounded by the limits of his own biological desirousness. For him, the Buddhists say the best thing is to have faith in the law of cause and effect. He is admonished to observe the outcome of his preoccupation with his autoerotic desires. Now, what they're talking about here is karma. And basically, it's the karma is the Buddhist rule for what goes around comes around. And then the second phase, the man in the ego stage of development, is called by the Buddhists the man of ordinary intellect. His attention is wholly directed to controlling his environment for his personal satisfaction and advantage. He has gained some control over his instinctive drives, and for him the ego is now king. He classifies everything in terms of his own wishes, taking the good and rejecting the evil, not realizing that what he discards falls into the unconscious and does not cease to exist. In this stage, the Buddhists say, the best thing is to recognize, both within and without oneself, the workings of the laws of opposites. So this is Dr. Jung's idea of opposites. So that's the man of ordinary intellect. Then the next phase, the state of the individual whom the Buddhists call man of superior intellect, corresponds to the third stage of our psychological classification. In him, the identification of the ego with the supreme value has been dissolved. In consequence, he experienced the inner dynamic factor as something other than the conscious ego, though definitely within the psyche. For his state, according to the Buddhists, the best thing is to have a thorough comprehension of the inseparableness of the knower, the object of knowledge, and the act of knowing. It must be borne in mind always that the psychological development we are discussing does not pertain to the individual's conscious personality nor to his outer mask or persona. A man may have acquired exemplary manners. His behavior may be courteous and correct. He may be highly educated and have all the appearances of culture, but his instinctive and natural reactions, could they be seen when he is alone, might reveal him as a very different person. Or in times of stress, physical or mental, he might astonish his friends and even himself by the undisciplined and primitive reactions that suddenly usurp the attitudes of the well-drilled persona. Such reactions do not come from the conscious part of the psyche. They arise from the non-personal part and reveal not the conscious character, but the stage of development that the non-personal psyche has reached. A man's instinctive reactions, being ectopsychic in origin, are largely beyond the control of his conscious ego. Their nature and character will be determined not by his conscious manners and opinions, nor even by his moral convictions, but by the extent to which the instincts themselves have undergone psychic modifications in him, a process depending in the first place, as noted above, on the functioning of the instinct or urge to reflect. The gradual change in form of these instinctive drives reveals itself also in the evolution of religions, for the compelling and all-powerful factors of the unconscious are personified in the divine figures of the various beliefs. Man, as has been most aptly said, makes God in his own image, in the image not of his conscious self, but of that objective psychological factor which rules supreme in the unconscious part of the psyche. The gradual transformation that has taken place in the religions of the world runs parallel with the slow transformation of the non-personal and instinctive parts of man's psyche. Okay. Yeah, in the earliest days, the gods were conceived of as entirely external to man. I just wanted to talk about those three phases. So, the man of little intellect is somebody who has to be controlled by karma and cause and effect. Okay, the second layer is man of ordinary intellect, and this is a person who's in the opposites and he's working with the opposites. And then a man of superior intellect is someone who can withdraw himself from the opposites and sort of observe from above. Image that I was showing last week of the adept who had the 5 other adepts above his head, and each one of them had 5 other adepts above their heads. And that's a person who can see things from every angle. So, as the Dalai Lama teaches it, you have to, any problem that you have to try to look at it from everybody's point of view, not only your point of view, but your boss's point of view, your fellow workers' point of view, maybe your employee's point of view, whatever it is. So that's what that is about.
That's really interesting, Skip. So for these 3 phases, can any person aspire to be quote unquote a man of high intellect, or are certain individuals more predisposed to become that person at that higher level?
Well, I think that in Buddhism, basically you're taught to, you go through the process of uh, achieving that level. I mean, intellectually, we can all know what it is, right? We can follow this idea of karma as cause and effect. And, we see this in how we handle our children, okay? Because our children have to know that if they keep wetting their pants at age 5, that maybe dad is going to give them a little spanking to wake them up, make them conscious of that. And so that's a cause and effect type of learning. There are other causes and effects that we have throughout our growing up years as we learn. then coming into the field of opposites, that's when you get into the individuation stage. And so that's, um, cause and effect. If you make love with your wife and she hasn't used birth control methods, good chance you're going to have a baby out of that, right? And so that's a cause and effect. The first half of life is largely ruled by that sort of cause and effect. And it's only when later on you get past that instinctual, reproductive, raise the next generation stage of your life that you start to understand what the opposites are, and that there's another point of view for something. Even, well, I mean, you probably understand it with your spouse because it comes up with your spouse fairly often, right? And you understand what the opposites are. Obviously, I know that if I criticize Debbie for anything, boy, her animus will come out and try to eat me alive. And but I've gotten to this stage where I recognize when that's happening, and I can say, "Whoa, there, brother! Could you just go back in the house and send my wife out, please, so that we can have a sensible conversation," type thing. Jerome points out that there are different forms of practice based upon different temperaments and levels of development. So, in Buddhism, and strictly speaking here, we're not talking about Buddhism, but Taoism. But in Buddhism, certainly there are lots of teachings. There are 84,000 teachings traditionally. So people are brought along. There's the 57 this and the 38 that and the 7 this and the 4 that and so on. And it's all full of logo. But ultimately, you have to have this aha, and then you at least get a glimpse of what they mean by enlightenment. Okay, traditionally, you can't really say that you're enlightened per se, because you can't be fully enlightened until you die. But people do have glimpses, and there's a daily quote that comes out on one of my listservs that is called Glimpse After Glimpse. And they try to give you a koan or something that gives you a sense of it. And after a while, you get the idea of what they're talking about. And so that's kind of how they do it. It's like a teaching like you would have in church or you would have in confirmation class, but in Christianity, we don't do it as thoroughly as we do it as it's done in Buddhism. Because in Buddhism, they're always trying to bring you along to the next stage, and there are 84,000 stages, so you'll be lucky if you could get through 1,000 of them. But anyway, there are different levels of development. And so obviously we can understand these conceptually from a logos point of view, but you have to grok it. And I think that Jungian psychology is a bit more pragmatic in that, in the sense that if you've had one of these religious experiences or you've had a significant synchronicity occur to you, you start to get a sense that there's something more here that you're not necessarily seeing, that's behind the scenes, that's in the unconscious, in the collective unconscious, and so on. And so, anyway, just see, I might have gone a little bit too far. Consciousness is no longer preoccupied with compulsive plans, but dissolves into contemplative vision. So you can withdraw if something's happening that's too intense. You can just go and meditate and let the answer emerge from yourself. So paragraph 66, to understand and explain this detachment, is a therapeutic effect par excellence. Now, this is the attachment of being above the opposites. And so in the Marine Corps, we had a couple of sayings which kind of got the essence of this, which was if you didn't want to do something or you were mad that the sergeant made you do this or that. And one saying was, it's not my life and it's not my wife, so why worry? I'll just take care of it, right? Then if you had done something wrong and you were going to get punished for it, the comment was, what are they going to do? Shave my head and send me to Nam? Obviously, if you're in Vietnam, well, so what? Throw me in the brig, then I don't have to go out in the field, type thing, right? But the idea is the dissolution of the participation mystique. And of course, in the Marine Corps, you have a participation mystique because they do want you to be uniform and not think for yourself. Because if you give a command in the Marine Corps, you want everybody to do it and you want everybody to know what you're doing, when you're doing it, where you're doing it, why you're doing it, all those things. Anyway, but participation mystique is a hallmark of primitive mentality, and it's a large remnant of non-differentiation between subject and object. Keep in mind that subject is you, inside you, and the object is outside you. And so in primitive cultures, people weren't so conscious about what was in them and what was outside them. And so, there could be ghosts and gods. And I remember my 5-year-old daughter, one of my daughters, started writing a series of short stories on the adventures of the pencil people. And so she was having this imagination about these pencil people, and this went on for a couple of months, and she was definitely into it, and then it went away, and I so wish that we had kept her notes on that, because she kept, she wrote down stories about the pencil people and so on that she was obviously seeing. We think we're above this, but we're not. Just witness horror films. Something in us wants us to be frightened by some awful thing so that when we walk out of the theater, we know, oh, good, we have a normal life. It's not like that type thing. You want to take the girl to the horror film because she'll grab your hand, and maybe more if she gets scared. Maybe she's complicit in that because she wants to grab your hand, or she wants you to grab her hand, or she wants your hand available for other things besides being at the movie. We shamelessly say we're above this. Instead of amulets and animal sacrifices, we use tranquilizers, neurosis, rationalism, and the cult of the will. We say we can control it. Well, we can't necessarily. Okay, paragraph 67. If unconscious is recognized, then the center of gravity of the total personality shifts a little bit toward the self. And you know that the ego is not the boss anymore. And you suffer only as Dr. Jung says, in the lower story, which is the ego. Paragraph 68. So the superior personality then is the holy fruit, the diamond body, and it symbolizes an attitude beyond the reach of emotional entanglements and violent shocks. So you're above the fray, let's say. You can detach from life. And Dr. Jung says that this is a natural preparation for death. So once you hit the midpoint of life, which traditionally is 35, then death is a goal, actually. And from a psychological perspective, it's a goal. And so in medieval monasteries, the brothers, when they would see each other in the morning, would say Momento Mori, which meant remember death. And it's And Buddhism is all about death. Okay, Buddhism wants you to be thinking about death all the time. It wants that because it wants you to put meaning into your life. And so it reminded me of um, it reminded me of the scene from the movie Patton, where George C. Scott is in front of the American flag giving um, his oration, and he says, uh, when your grandchild is sitting on your lap and he says, "What did you do in the Great World War II, Granddad?" You won't have to say, "Well, I shoveled shit in Louisiana." So, what is the meaning of your life? That's the point. One of the big things that Dr. Jung was always emphasizing is that you can't live a life without meaning. And obviously, if you have small children, and your children are a meaning of life, obviously. But then when your children get a little older and go off to college, then what are you about? Once you hit 50, let's say, and you're going to live another 50 years, what is your contribution to the Great Mosaic of Life? That's one of Dr. Jung's ideas. So obviously, some people get to put more panels into the mosaic than others, but if you can't imagine a panel that you're going to put into the mosaic of life, then life loses its meaning too to you. So it's always a good idea to remember that, and remember that um, you can die at any moment. So
Yeah, I
um,
always find it very interesting that those that stay engaged, post retirement, tend to live longer lives than those that tend to not have any passion outside of their normal day to day routine.
very
And
definitely.
I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that there's definitely something to that.
Definitely. There's definitely something physiological about that. And also, where, especially wives who have taken their whole meaning of their life in their husband's uh, career, let's say, and their husband dies, then they live a husk life after that. One of the things that Jungian analysts try to do is to put people back in touch with their instincts. I mean, my mother-in-law is like that. I mean, she's a wonderful woman. She was the perfect mother archetype, but her husband died 25 years ago, and since then, she really hasn't known what to do. And unfortunately, because she's my mother in law, I can't really help her with that. So, one of Dr. Jung's dicta here is that beware, you have to make the most of this life. When you're dead, and you don't know you're dead. And if your spirit is going to live on, it's going to live on in some form that you leave behind. Now, it could be in a child, for example, or a grandchild, even, where you have somehow influenced them. One of the reasons I work with my Palestinian woman friend is because I want her, when she's 80 years old, to remember me. And so yesterday, and remember how I mentored her and helped her get started with her life. So yesterday I was able to give her a tour of Annapolis, which was extremely meaningful to her and to me as well. But it's a trip that she won't forget for the rest of her life, for sure. And so if your spirit is going to live on, it's going to live on in that way, even if she doesn't consciously think about it, or even if your grandchild doesn't consciously think about it. They may do things in their lives because of the way you did something in your life that was passed on to your child, and your child passed it on to the grandchild. And that has meaning. And, you know, it it's not going to, nobody's going to make a movie about it. But at the same time, you know, even people who make movies, I don't know where they're going to be in 500 years. You know, Dr. Jung obviously left his spirit behind big time because we're still talking about him tonight. He's not going to be forgotten forever, probably, or at least in some way. Some of his basic concepts will be passed down through generations of humans all over the world. You know, I view myself as just carrying the baton a little farther for him and Edward Edinger. And, you know, there's nothing special about what I'm doing except I can social network it and spread it out into the ether.